A few weeks ago, I had to travel from the outskirts of my city into the downtown for a job interview. The process took all night long, and the employers kept asking for more and more paperwork. I had just moved, and not all of my documents had arrived in or been renewed yet. Eventually, it got to the point where I couldn't even proceed in the hiring process without more documentation, and I had to leave the office blocks and go back home in the middle of the night. Understandably, I was a bit annoyed, and the situation wasn't helped when I got to the subway station and saw that one of the tracks was under maintenance. The train was delayed and it would be coming in late. Irritated, I sat down on a concrete bench and started idly looking through my phone, as one often does when bored. The station that I was stuck in was not one of the nicer stations in the city. It was located directly on the onset of the inner city, and because of its fairly inconvenient location, it was almost always empty. Tonight was no exception, and I was the only person in the entire underground. About a minute into my waiting, I heard footsteps coming from the other end of the station. As they drew closer, I heard muffled conversation and eventually saw an old First Nations man shuffling down the stairway from the above-ground station. He was speaking on the phone. I'm not sure if he was homeless, but he looked rough around the edges and had clearly seen his fair share of the streets. Not wanting to stare, I returned my gaze to my phone, but kept a conscious ear out for the man. As unpleasant as being alone in the night is, it is far worse to be alone with a single stranger. As I listened to the man's conversation, I began to realize something. He wasn't speaking English, rather his conversation was in Cree, one of the local indigenous languages. I study linguistics, and I naturally found it fascinating to hear Aboriginal languages being spoken conversationally, on account of it being an extremely rare thing to hear outside of reservations. So, not looking up from my phone, I turned my hearing into this conversation ever so slightly more. Although my knowledge of Cree is minimal, I nonetheless immediately noticed several bizarre characteristics of this man's speech. It's difficult to explain exactly, but it sounded as if he was constantly changing his tone of voice and emotion. One second, it sounded as if he was speaking to an old friend, and the next he would switch tones completely, sounding grave and serious, as if he was speaking to his boss or a figure of authority. It was a subtle enough change that I didn't initially notice it until I started listening in, but once I did notice it, it was impossible to ignore it. I've never heard anybody speak like he was, let alone without once changing the volume of his voice. I checked the station clock, 4 minutes until the train arrived. The man's conversation seemed to be slowing down, and his replies became shorter and gruffer, down to the point to where they just became one-word utterances, as if he were confirming a list. He paused for a moment, and then clear as day said something he had no right to say. Well, he said my last name. As a note, I have an extremely uncommon and difficult to pronounce surname. I've since looked at several independent national census reports, and they all seem to indicate that there's only about a dozen people in the entire country with my surname. And at that, they're all located on the opposite side of the country, over 3,000 kilometers away. I am the only person with my surname across this entire range. I should emphasize as well how perfectly he pronounced it. I can count the number of times that somebody has correctly pronounced my name the first time on one hand, but this guy nailed it, even down the aspirations. I know that what he said wasn't a word in Cree either, as I've since spoken to one of my linguistics professors, and he's told me that my surname is a phonological impossibility in Cree or any other Algonquin language. I was absolutely bewildered when I heard the man say it. There was absolutely nothing on my person that had my surname printed on it. All of my documentation was in my breast pocket under 2 layers of clothing. I didn't know how to react. It felt as if my entire reality had started to spin in circles. I fought against my urges to look at the man. I almost felt as if I looked at him, this whole situation would become real. His conversation continued without missing a beat. A few minutes later, the train arrived. I got on immediately and sat in a carriage across from a transit security officer. As the train pulled out of the station, I glanced through the adjacent window at the man, still standing in the underground. He looked up at me for the briefest moment before going back to his phone call. On the ride back, I had almost calmed my heartbeat before I realized something. The train that I was riding was the only train that was going to that station that night. The other track was under maintenance and nothing would have come on it at all that night. If he wanted to catch a train, there was literally no other option than to catch the train I was riding, which he very deliberately didn't do. Then I realized something else. I had seen the man enter into the underground through the staircase from the above-ground shelter. Not only was the above-ground shelter warmer or more spacious than the underground, but it had another advantage as well: cell service. If he wanted to make a phone call, why did he leave the warm quality reception of the above ground to make his call in the cold dark underground if he didn't have the intention of catching a train? And why did his phone call contain a name that belonged to only one person in 3,000 kilometers? I know this story isn't as creepy as most, and it's not your typical let's not meet, but it really creeps me out, and I guess I'll never know why he said my name. The story happened about 2 weeks ago. My name is Amanda and I'm 16 years old. I was at a bus stop after spending the day at my friend's house waiting to go home. I was sat down scrolling through Instagram on my phone as I waited. I looked up now and then to check to see if I could see my bus coming and to see if anyone else was around the bus stop. The one time I looked up, I noticed a man across the street looking in my direction. He was staring at me, but I didn't think much of it at that moment, and carried on looking at my phone. After about 2 minutes, I looked up again to see the man still standing there, still staring at me. I was thinking this is weird, but I tried not to pay attention to him and hoped my bus would turn up soon. After about 3 minutes of nervously looking through my phone, trying to ignore the strange man, I glanced up a third time to see that he wasn't there anymore, and I let out a small sigh of relief. 5 minutes go by, and someone tapped my shoulder. It startled me, and I turned around to see that it was the creepy guy that had been watching me. He spoke and then said,
"Hey, do you got a light?"
with a bent cigarette in his mouth, also grinning with his yellow teeth. I said in a nervous reply, "No, I don't smoke." His reply back was,
"I bet you don't,"
and let out a quiet chuckle. I didn't know what to think of that, but he was making me uncomfortable now, and even more than he was before. He stood by me at the bus stop and proceeded to light a cigarette with a match. I thought, why did he ask me for a light if he had matches the whole time? Was it just some excuse to talk to me? About a minute passed by until he spoke again. Whilst smoking, he then said,
"You know, it's been a long time since I had some good tail."
He took another puff of his cigarette and then said,
"Yup, you'll do just fine."
He threw his cigarette on the ground and turned towards me. My heart was beating out of my chest and I was breathing heavily, going into flight or fight mode. When my bus lights pulled up around the corner down the street, the man saw the lights and then ran off. I waved the bus down in a panic. I was so scared for what could have happened to me. Thank God my bus turned up when it did. Me and my wife Claire were on our way to Rotterdam for the weekend to visit her family, as it was her father's birthday. We live in Brussels, so the drive there would take around just over 2 hours or so, but we left at about 9:30 p.m. because I get home from work around 9 and my boss wouldn't let me finish earlier, which means we would get to Claire's parents' house later in the day than we would have liked. But her parents usually stay up late, and as it was her father's birthday weekend, they probably would be awake celebrating, and it wouldn't be a problem. About an hour into the drive, we decided to stop at a gas station to refuel the car and get some coffee. It was dark, cold, and pouring with rain, so we didn't want to take too long. Claire went inside to get some coffee, snacks, and use the bathroom and pay for the gas. As I was putting the gas into the car, I noticed a strange-looking man in the short distance. He was staring very intensely at my wife as she walked into the gas station, but what bothered me more was how odd and how out of place he looked. He had no car or people with him from what I could see. He had long stringy hair, bad trimmed scruffy beard, and he was only wearing blue jeans, a white tank top, and trainers on. I thought it was crazy as it was January and freezing cold with the pouring rain. Why was he here at a gas station at this time far from anywhere, and barely clothed for the current weather? At the time I was thinking this guy must have been out of his mind. I tried to ignore him and look elsewhere, as I wanted to avoid drawing attention to myself from this strange man as much as I could. But not long after, I decided to look back to check if he was still there, because I was very much distracted and unsettled by him, and couldn't look away for long, but when I looked back, he was gone. I was very relieved, as I didn't want him staring at my wife Claire when she came back. Just as I was thinking that, I heard a psst behind me. It was him. The creepy guy that was staring at Claire was now staring at me and smiling. He looked so much worse up close, so tired like he hadn't slept in years. He had horrible crooked yellow teeth and scars across his neck. His jeans were ripped and muddled, and his trainers had holes in them. I just froze. I was startled and was thrown off by a sudden appearance behind me, and then after an awkward moment of intense silence, he then spoke. He said in his gruff voice,
"Your wife."
Then he leaned closer and he smiled awful like he hadn't bathed in months. He then said,
"I want to take a bite out of your wife. Not just a bite though, a nice juicy bite."
And then he grinned a smile from ear to ear, showing his vile teeth once more. At this point, I was ready to have a physical confrontation, but after that, he turned around and walked away laughing and talking to himself. I quickly finished putting gas in the car and jogged into the gas station and made sure Claire was safe. I then walked her back to the car. As I entered the station, she was just finishing paying for gas and the snacks. She turned to me and said, "Hey, what's the matter? You look like you've seen a ghost. Are you okay?" I told her about the creep outside, but I'll tell you about it when we're back on the road. Let's just go. We got back to the car and started to pull out of the station and make our way back on the motorway. Just as we're leaving, I looked in the rearview mirror to see that the creepy guy is standing in the road in the rain, just watching us and laughing. I told Claire about the man and the encounter that I had with him. She was just as freaked out as I was and was glad I came inside the station and made sure she got to the car okay. About a week later, I saw on the news that a woman had been assaulted near a gas station. A man attempted to grab her and assumed to kill her. Luckily, she escaped from him, but through the struggle, the man had bitten her very hard on the back of the neck, and the woman reported as she escaped from his grip and ran away. The man then screamed, saying,
"All I want is a juicy bite. Just one more bite."
Just before bursting into a mad laughter. I was stunned, and I instantly knew the man who attacked that woman, and the incident took place at the same gas station. I told Claire and informed the authorities shortly after. From what I know, to this day, that insane man was never apprehended. Be careful with strange men around gas stations. You never know what could happen. This story happened 2 months ago and takes place in the Netherlands. My name is Kim. I'm a 24-year-old waitress and I just finished my shift at the restaurant that I work at. I live in a small apartment complex. After a long, stressful week, I just wanted to have a relaxing Friday night. I took a bath, played some Black Ops 4, and then around 7:30 p.m. I decided to order a pizza. So I rang Domino's and I heard the phone answer, but there was a slight pause before I heard someone speak. I could just make out some muffled breathing. I said, hello? Then right after I spoke, a man then said, "Domino's Pizza, can I take your order?" Which I thought was strange because why didn't he say that when he picked up the phone? But I brushed it off. I ordered a large pepperoni and sausage pizza with stuffed crust, some garlic bread, and a big bottle of Pepsi, which he replied, "For pickup or delivery?" I said delivery and gave him my address, and he told me it would take around 30 to 40 minutes to arrive. I then told him thank you, and he replied with, "The pleasure is mine." Then he hung up abruptly. I was just thinking to myself, what a strange thing to say, and kind of laughed it off, thinking maybe he was just joking or something, but still, it weirded me out. About 35 minutes passed until I heard a slow knock on my door. 4 knocks to be exact, with about 2 seconds in between each knock. I opened the door to see a large bald man holding my pizza. He then said, "Hello, young lady," and handed me the pizza and said, "That will be 22 euros and 40 cents. Which I thought was a very weird thing to say, as that's something you usually say to a child. I took the pizza and gave him the money. As I handed him the cash, he kind of grabbed the money where he could also touch my hand and slide his fingers on the palm of my hand, which really creeped me out. As I looked up, he had a big smile on his face and his eyes were bulging. I awkwardly smiled and said to keep the change, and then shut the door. I sat down, turned on the TV, and started to eat my pizza. About 2 minutes go by since I got my pizza, and then I heard a slow knock on my door. Same as before, 4 knocks with 2 seconds in between each knock. I thought to myself, It can't be the pizza guy again, could it? What could he want? I was already creeped out and I didn't want to deal with him again. I checked through the peephole and to my surprise, there was no one there. I opened my door and said, hello? Anybody there? I looked left and right down the dingy lit corridor and didn't see anything. This is weird, I thought. Just as I was about to close the door, I looked down to see a bottle of Pepsi and garlic bread. It was from my order. I forgot to take it in with me in the house because I wanted to end my encounter with that freaky bald man as quickly as I could. I carried on eating and watching TV. After I finished my pizza, I got up to throw the cardboard away and take out the trash. I went out my apartment and headed downstairs outside to the big rubbish bin. I glanced across the car park and I noticed the car was parked and there was someone in there just staring at me. I couldn't make out who it was because it was too dark. I entered my apartment again and carried on playing my PlayStation. After a few hours or so, I got tired of playing and decided to go to bed and read my book before getting some sleep. About 15 minutes into reading, I heard a knock on my door. A slow knock. Now I was scared I knew who this was. I didn't get up out of bed. I just tried to ignore it and see if he would go away. He didn't. The knocking continued. I plucked up the courage and got up to look through the peephole. The man was staring right through glass, smiling like he did earlier, but this time with a menacing look on his face and bloodshot eyes. When I saw this, I jumped back and gasped out of fear and shock. He must have heard me because as soon as I made a noise, his knocking turned into pounding, and he started screaming. He was turning my doorknob, trying to break in. I ran to my phone and called the police. The banging stopped shortly after. I thought he might have left because maybe he heard me call the police. I checked the peephole once again, and he wasn't gone. He was standing there, not smiling this time, just staring at the glass hole with a blank expression, muttering to himself. The police finally arrived and arrested him. I don't know what happened to that man that night, or why he was doing what he did. I just pray to God that I'll never see him again, and I'll think twice when ordering a pizza. The story happened when I was 5 years old and takes place in the UK. I'm a male and my name is George. My nan had started to say that her house was haunted and tell my mom that she would hear things in the house. My granddad had passed away a few months before this, and as my mom didn't really believe in ghosts or things like that, she thought my nan was lonely since her husband had passed away, so she wouldn't take much notice to what my nan was telling her. Every now and then my mom, who was a single mother at the time, would have to go away for a few days at a time because of her job. So I would just stay over at a friend's house or my cousin's, but my nan was having some trouble, and we guessed she was feeling lonely, but my mom decided that I would stay with her for the few days that my mom would be away. We get to the house and say goodbye to my mom. Later that day, my nan was cooking dinner and I was sat in the front room watching some cartoons and playing with action figures. I then heard footsteps coming from the room above me, which was my nan's bedroom. The floor was creaking. I just thought that my nan had maybe gone upstairs for something. I then got up to go get a Coke from the fridge. I walked in the kitchen and I was completely startled when I saw my nan cooking in the kitchen. I thought she was upstairs. She looked at me and said, "You okay, sweetie? Dinner will be ready soon." I was confused but just shrugged it off and said okay, got my drink, and carried on watching cartoons, thinking maybe it was just the wind or the house making noise or something. Some time passed after eating dinner. It was soon time for me to get ready for bed, so I headed upstairs to brush my teeth and put my PJs on. As I walked past my nan's bedroom after getting ready to head back downstairs, I heard a sort of bang coming from inside. I stopped and turned to face the slightly ajar door, and I saw that the room was dark. Nan was definitely not in there. She was downstairs, so I wondered what could have made the noise. I nervously opened the door very slowly and looked inside the dark room. From what I could make out from the hallway light shining through it, it was empty and nobody was in there. I switched on the light and walked in to check the room. I saw that a picture frame had fallen on the floor from her vanity, and I walked over to pick it up, and the more I entered the room, I felt the cold type of cold that you don't feel often. The type of cold where it feels like there's a presence with you. I got to the picture frame and picked it up. It was my granddad. I looked at it for a moment, thinking how much I miss him. I then placed the picture back on the vanity, and just as I did that, something happened. Something that I'll never forget. I turned towards her walk-in cupboard that was next to her vanity, and the door started slowly opening. I froze in complete fear, and my eyes were wide open. I watched as the door was slowly opening, and a hand appeared around the door. I started breathing heavily, and then following the hand was a face appearing around the door. A pale white face with blue eyes, cold as ice, looking straight through me. I screamed and started crying, running out of the room and downstairs, straight into my nan's arms. I couldn't get my words out as I was so scared and upset. I eventually calmed down and explained to my nan what I saw. She held me and just looked up at the ceiling. She told me it's okay and that she's here now. We slept downstairs in the front room that night. As you can imagine, I didn't get much sleep. I just laid there cuddling with my nan on the sofa bed, just staring up at the ceiling, hearing the upstairs floor creak all night long. It's like my nan knew what I saw because she was looking up with me. The next day, my mom came to pick me up. Her work trip had finished a day earlier, so I got up to go home and I didn't have to stay at my nan's house another night. Looking back now, I wish I had stayed with my nan. She must have been terrified being there all on her own, but I was too young and afraid to think like that. Right before we left, my nan had told me something. She told me that everything will be okay and she loves me. That was the last time I saw her and spoke to her. She died 3 weeks later. I never told anyone about what I experienced until today. I'm 23 now, and looking back, I think my nan knew what was going to happen to her. I truly believe that whatever that thing was in that house is responsible for her passing. I just pray to God it wasn't. To preface this story, I want to give some context. I didn't have a car for most of the time I was in high school, not getting one until my senior year. That left me either having to walk where I wanted to go, get someone to drive me, or just not go where I want to at all. This left me homebound during a lot of my free time, since a lot of the time my siblings didn't want to give me a ride to places I could go and chill. Though the neighborhood that I lived in itself was considered affluent, it was located in the south part of town and was and still is pretty seedy. This included the closest gas station to my house, which when walking to it was about an hour away. I did and still do have a large appetite, so whenever I had some extra cash, I would always walk there at night to grab some snacks. Admittedly, walking there in the dead of night wasn't a good idea, especially with the type of people who hung out around the area, but I felt like it was my only option. I'm rather overweight, and I have been all my life, which led to my father being very controlling of my diet, and he would always be passive-aggressively judgmental of whatever I ate. This led me into a mentality of hiding my eating habits, including getting food late at night to eat, and including walking to that gas station. This was another one of those nights, and I was about a quarter of the way there. Being the nervous and paranoid person I am, I had been checking over my shoulder and keeping my eyes peeled on my general area because the last thing I wanted to happen was get jumped at the dead of night. At this point in my walk, I was nearing the homeless shelter that was on the route to the gas station. On the side of the building facing the road, there's a garbage retainer walled off with a wooden fence. You can smell it right before you see it, and on the hot southern summer night, I could smell it hard. I increased my speed out of instinct to get out of the building's vicinity because of that, before my eyes caught him. There was a guy leaning against the fence that walled off the garbage retainer. It took a bit more of staring as I walked by to realize what he was doing. He was jacking off, fully blown in view of anyone walking past. Though it freaked me out, I can't say I was surprised. A lot of drug addicts and mentally ill people who couldn't afford proper help congregated this area, and I had figured that this guy was just another one of those people. Either way, I increased my already quick pace to get out of the area. I wish that was the end of this, but unfortunately it wasn't. The guy still going at it down there managed to get up and began following me. I was on the verge of tears at this point, scared that he was going to catch up to me and do God knows what to me. I increased how fast I was going even more, fully prepared to run at the drop of the hat if the guy did, though I knew in the back of my mind if he really wanted to, he could probably catch up to me pretty easily due to how unathletic I was. But he kept his distance, continuing to follow me until I finally managed to reach the gas station. The amount of joy and relief that I felt at seeing it, I can't manage to properly describe. I dashed in there and alerted the attendant to what was going on, asking if I could linger in there for a bit. She was more than happy to oblige and asked if I wanted to call the police, but stupidly, I said no. I didn't want my dad finding out what I had been doing, And honestly, at that point I just wanted to get back to the safety of my house and not deal with the cops. After waiting around for a bit, I checked outside and didn't see the guy who had followed me. I decided that it was as good of time as ever, so I went back inside, got what I came for, and called a friend to have on the phone with me as I walked back home. Thankfully, the guy who had followed me was nowhere to be found on my way back, and I got back to my place in one piece. This didn't end my night crawls, but I didn't leave to go to the gas station for a while, and definitely not without letting a friend know where I was going. This experience isn't of mine, but of my mother. She's been a truck driver for 26 years. Yes, a very long time. She is the only female driver at her company. Being a female driver, she's experienced a lot of odd and very weird things on the road and truck stops that she's been on. She has always told me that she feels unsafe at a truck stop, and she would not get out of her cab, meaning she would not even try to take a bathroom break at a truck stop. While my mom was driving down the road in Mason City, Iowa late at night with a load on a 4-way road, there was a dark Ford truck driving beside her. He sped up a little and she noticed there was a blue tarp over the back and the back hatch was down. He had hit a bump somewhere in the road, and to her surprise, she saw what looked like an arm flop out from under the tarp and was dangling there. The person must have noticed this and pulled over to an empty parking lot. My mother stopped at the stop sign staring. She hurried and dialed 911. The man had noticed that she had seen this as he looked her in the eyes and flopped the arm back under the tarp and put the back hatch up. The man wasn't too tall. He had dark hair, light skin, and dark clothes. My mother told the police the color of the truck and license plate number and location. She thanked he noticed her because he started to follow her truck. As she was telling me this story, in the back of my mind I was thinking she could have just run him over if she needed to. My mother said that she had a very bad gut feeling about him following her, and she kept driving through the town. She locked her doors in case she needed to stop somewhere. The guy's truck suddenly disappeared by turning into a different road. She sighed in relief. When my mother got home the next day, which was on a Friday, I was in my high school years, and she was telling her girlfriend at the time the story. But the news came up and reported that a news lady had vanished and never came to work. My mother felt very cold and was thinking that she might have seen her body, or at least part of it, and her killer. But unfortunately, the police never called back about the driver. They never found the lady's body either. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you have your own personal scary story, be sure to submit that to my subreddit at reddit.com/r/southerncannibal. or to my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new stories. And before we bring this video to a close, I just want to shout out all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 or more patrons featured on screen. Shout out to Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Celeste S, Ellie S, Emily W, Heather B, Howard R, Jacqueline W, Jazzy G, Jonathan C, Lori J, Matthew B, Michael G, Random Randy, Steph L, Tammy S, and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it more than you know. And if any of you would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thank you everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always stay on.